This is the Atari ST podcast.
In coin-op, I had a soundboard. I owned a processor. It's my sandbox. I can do anything I want. But the minute you're doing console work, you're now seen as the programmer as a parasitic element that eats CPU and storage and poops out sound. I think ultimately doing the Q Bert voice was the finest destiny of that technology.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. David Thiel is a musician and interactive audio designer. At Gottlieb, he did the sound for arcade games including Reactor, Q Bert, and Mach 3. At Action Graphics, David created the sound for Artillery Duel for the Atari 2600 and Beamrider and Pitstop for the Atari computers. And at Free Radical Software / Incredible Technologies, he worked on winter games for the Amiga and Atari ST. He has created the sound and music for dozens of other computer games and pinball machines. This interview took place on May 17, 2016.
I've always been a performer. I started in high school. I played in bands. I got paid to play in bands, and then I went off to college, and then I graduated from college, and I immediately joined a band and did nothing with my college degree.
What instrument did you play?
Keyboards. And that's a loose definition because, organ was the keyboard that was available to play in bands for a long time. And then came electric pianos, Fender Rhodes, and then eventually synthesizers. And all of those give you radically different capabilities as someone who approaches the instrument from a keyboard. But yeah, keyboards. So I was an entertainer, and I managed to make a living doing that, playing 5 and 6 nights a week for almost 7 years after college. But that became not possible to do. So I finally took what I call a day job. And it was a very interesting one because there was a company, a retail store that was unique in Chicago. They sold synthesizers, and in that time they were all monophonic, so there were Moog synthesizers and ARP synthesizers and things from Roland and Korg. And this store called the Electric Keyboard on the north side of Chicago sold these. They didn't sell home organs, and they were not a family music store. They concentrated on professional musicians who wanted this new technology. Then the other half of the store was the first Apple II dealer ever in Chicago. This is at the time before there's even a disk drive for the Apple II. It's just an Apple II connected to a TV with an RF modulator and a cassette, which marginally stored programs from time to time. And I got into this partly because we had such grim weather in the late 70s. And I had a Volkswagen Rabbit, and I could get to the store because I had front-wheel drive. And no customers could get to the store for months, really on end. And in that time, I was an avid electronics hobbyist, and I had always wanted a computer. So I had my first real hands-on access with a decent computer. I'd built my own Cosmic Elf, 1802, but the best I could do with that was put a primitive picture of the Starship Enterprise on the TV screen, typing in something. So I had access to the Apple II, and I basically learned to program there at the store. I had several great mentors. There was a guy named Chris Oberth who was cranking out almost arcade stuff for that quality at that time, games. And we had a whole catalog of things that we sold in plastic bags for the Apple II.
Sure.
Then we got a disk drive, that was a big deal. And eventually we also sold Atari 400 800s out of this store. And so that's where I really became a programmer. But this store was eventually went out of business, and I decided I needed a real job. So I took a job at an insurance company where they trained me to be a PL1 programmer. But since I kind of knew programming, I did real well, and so they made me the trainer for the next class because I had a background and I'm comfortable talking to people. Mm-hmm. So 2 years of that. Now, my video game thing had already been started way back when I was playing in rock bands. My first experience was with an Atari game. About 1971, I was playing Computer Space. And but it was crazy hard. I don't know. Left, right, thrust, and fire, Computer Space. Mm-hmm. They didn't have much ability to tweak the difficulty of that game because I don't even know if there was a processor. I think it was a giant TTL state machine. If you ever looked at the board, you could turn it around and you could see the outlines of the ships because they were encoded as a diode matrix.
Huh. Wow. And
based on the orientation of the diodes on the circuit board, you could see the shapes of the ships. Literally, it was that primitive. So the game was crazy hard because they really didn't have much leeway to tweak it. But we found, a friend of mine and I found that if we divided the left-right thrust-fire thing between two people, so I would do thrust-fire and he would do steering, that we could play a lot longer. We always figured that the mothership would come down and mistakenly take us, assuming that they had found the best human player on the planet.
Sure. Right.
Yeah.
Like a Last Starfighter thing gone
exactly.
wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we thought, but it didn't happen. But I was hugely intrigued by that. And then when I was in rock bands, we would have four breaks a night, and a lot of places had arcade games. But at that time, the game was it was a submarine game, Depth Charge, Gremlin's Depth Charge. I think it was about 1977, 78. And I played a ton of that. That was my favorite. So I was hugely interested in that. And of course, then I had a console game, like everybody, but I picked the loser. I had a choice.
Was it you go with the Fairchild? Or
yes. Yes, I went with System F.
Yeah, Channel F. Yeah.
It had a very cool joystick. It was an up, down, left, right joystick, and then the knob turned too, so it gave you 2 more degrees of freedom. Yeah, I thought that was very cool, and I think it was $10 cheaper at Penny's than the Atari 2600. So I bought the Fairchild System F. That was kind of bad. That was not a winner. So I had this parallel interest. I really liked video games, but I had chosen for my career data processing because being a musician playing was not viable anymore after disco hit. But I got a call from a headhunter after a couple years at the insurance company. I get this headhunter who calls and says, "Oh, we know you're an avid computer hobbyist, and there's this game company starting." Video game company, and would you like to interview? Well, that sounds intriguing. So I went on the interview, this big empty warehouse where they were just beginning to build the offices and stuff. And it turns out that it was one of the big pinball companies, Gottlieb, who were owned by Columbia Pictures by that time. And video games had really hit pinball machines hard at that time, especially in the United States. Operators saw that, in half the space for zero the maintenance, they could make all this money, and so they stopped buying pinballs almost completely. So Gottlieb got the word from corporate that they had to start making video games because Bally had already done so and been very successful with Space Invaders and Pac-Man. And Williams had gotten into it and built their own video game division, and of course had Defender by that time. And Gottlieb didn't have anything. So they licensed a couple games from somebody that were dismally unsuccessful. New York, New York. Familiar?
Yeah, yeah.
Horrible game. But it was intriguing because they had enough memory to put up a bitmap of the Statue of Liberty on the screen. And then the other half of the screen played kind of a Space Invaders game. But there was no relationship between the two images. It was just they put the Statue of Liberty up there, kind of as a tour de force, and then called the game New York, New York. It was amazing. So in any case, they decided to go the Williams route and create a video game division. And I got interview, and I was hired after convincing them that, you work in an insurance company, why should we hire you? And I said, well, I can create a video game. So I went home and used the Apple high-res routines and used the joysticks and made little triangles that shot little things from the end of the triangle. And I don't think I had hit detection yet, but I came back in a week and said, here's a video game. I think I put some numbers up there as faux scores. And I got the job. So I was programming, I was using an Apple II and programming graphics utilities, because they had a sprite engine and they needed something to build the matrices of the little squares that were sprites. Okay, but by the time I got to the end of the first game, which was designed by their hired gun, Tim Skelly of Cinematronics fame, they looked around and said, gee, we have no sound yet. So that was it. I raised my hand. I said, I'm your man. And then I've been doing that ever since. So that was like 1981.
Awesome. What game was that? That first one?
The first one was Reactor, which I looked around and heard what was going on. You could hear the music in Pac-Man and stuff. I said, really, 11 to 15-year-old boys, I'm not sure they want to hear this sort of mall demonstration organ music. I think they want to hear something gnarlier. So Reactor really features the first thing that sounds like rock and roll, I think, ever in a video game.
Unstable. Base lift.
I was happy with that. It was a real trick because we were doing a soft approach, a 6502 and an 8-bit converter, and 128 bytes of RAM. And
when you say soft approach, you mean there wasn't dedicated sound hardware? I mean, what do you mean?
Yeah, the only dedicated sound hardware was the analog to digital converter. So it's all you're hearing is algorithms pumping numbers to that converter, which get amplified by an amplifier and literally move the speaker. So given the limitations of the extremely small amount of CPU, it was a trick. Any sound that we made was kind of an interesting technique and nothing like legitimate synthesis. So Williams had used this approach, and the sounds in Defender and Roboton are terrific. And I was using this approach, and I did something, I wanted to just do something different. I wanted to distinguish myself, and so we could compete, and I didn't want to sound like them. So I took a very different approach. And the Reactor was the first one. It wasn't tremendously successful. I think they made 3,000 of them. Second game didn't get made at all.
Protector?
Yes, Argus, Protector. It was 4 names. Video Man and
Guardian.
Yeah. It was known, from my point of view, it was Protector.
Mm-hmm.
4 names. Video Man and Guardian. Yeah. It was known from my point of view, it was Protector. Yeah. It was known from my point of view, it was Protector. Yeah. It was known from my point of view, it was Protector. Yeah. It was known from my point of view, it was Protector. But they did focus tests, and then they changed the name, and they could never. It was never good enough to make.
Is this Protector? There was a arcade. There was a game on the Atari called Protector. It was basically a Defender clone. Is this the same?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so.
All right.
Maybe it was. Who? Mattel? Or no. It was a toy company secured the rights to all Gottlieb video games, and I knew I was in the right business after all these years of being a musician and really trying to get original tunes out there and stuff. The first time I ever heard my music on TV was in a commercial for Reactor on the 2600. They used the coin-op music in the TV commercial, shown nationwide. And I thought, okay,
Nice.
I'm in the right place at the right time. So that was it. A career that I could not have imagined when I was in college. The technology just didn't exist. I had fallen into somehow. I think I would have always gotten here, but it was happening in '81, and I was thrilled. And I did. I think five or six games were manufactured. More games I did that weren't manufactured out of Gottlieb. But the writing was on the wall.
Sure.
In '83, it sort of went like this: that operators are typically not deep thinkers, and so they would see what one Pac-Man made a week. And so they just did the simple math and said, well, gee, if I had 50 Pac-Men, I would make that much more. And so they just bought tons and tons and tons of Pac-Man and spent all their budget on that. And eventually, that well dried up, and they'd spent their money, and there wasn't any game which is as dominant as Pac-Man. And really, the whole industry sort of took a nosedive. The coin-operated industry really went down in about '83. Mm-hmm. So I left, and I found a company that was working in the home space. Mm-hmm. And this is Action Graphics.
Before we get there, let's put a pin in that for a second.
Okay.
I want to get there because before we leave Gottlieb, I want to talk about Q Bert.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of interesting things about Q Bert. First of all, it had this voice synthesis chip, which I imagine was expensive, and you only used it to swear in a Q Bert language, and so I read the story online on Wikipedia, but it's so good I would like you to tell it anyway.
Well, sure.
And also I'm interested in the thwack sound when the purple guy falls to the bottom. I thought that was very cool because that's actually a physical thing, not a speaker. Anyway, so I'd like you to talk about those things.
Sure. Well, the soundboard that I was given came from pinball, and it was created by a guy who's still a friend of mine named Jim Weiss, an electrical engineer. And it was a big deal at that time to have talking pinballs. Bally had done it, so Gottlieb had to do it. But Gottlieb chose a synthesis approach instead of, at that time, memory was so expensive that just recording somebody's voice and playing it back was prohibitive unless you only wanted to have like 2 words. And they typically wanted to say way more than that. So they picked this chip. They bought it from a company in Michigan named the Federal Screw Works, and it's the Voltrax chip. And the first pinball game, was Mars, God of War. I am Mars, God of War. Of course, the chip says that I am Mars, God of War. It's a synthesis chip. It's amazing in that time that it could talk at all. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it didn't talk very well. So I inherited this board, and management knew that there was this somewhat expensive part on the board, and they thought, well, their first video game should talk too. So that was part of, I'm a junior sound guy, and sure, I'll make it talk. But at that time, there were 0 tools toward that effort. All you had was a page of documentation from the Federal Screwworks that says, okay, we can say these 64 phonemes, our notion of phonemes.
Right.
And then you had a dictionary. And you had phonemes in the dictionary, and you tried to find the mapping. Of course, it wasn't one-to-one by any means. So you want to say stuff. So you try to break it down into phonemes and find the code. And you're all doing this by hand, and then you put it in, and you listen to it. And sometimes you get lucky. Most of the time you didn't. But there was one thing that we were doing where the particles in Reactor went into a chamber, which was this reactor chamber, and every time they hit the wall, you got points. That was a good thing. And then if you could keep those things in there, you'd get more and more points. And so you would cross thresholds. And these were called bonus points. So we thought it was very cool. It's a really good idea because it's an eyes busy, hands busy task. You're over on the left side of the screen. Meanwhile, there's particles trapped on the right side of the screen. And you want to announce to the player that you've achieved 5,000 bonus points, 10,000 bonus points. So it's a good idea. Motivated, it's real information for the player, and it's good for them. So I innocently tried to make it say 5,000 bonus points. And to my dismay, I discovered that it would only say 5,000 bonus points. And the obvious mapping of phonemes only produced this. And I go, wow. So then I started getting creative and started putting different kinds of things in there. And I spent really 8 hours trying to say these two words. And I was not getting a lot of traction. But there is this phenomenon, a psychological phenomenon called habituation. So if you work on a thing long enough, eventually it sounds right to you.
Right.
Then people would walk through the space where I was, because I had moved away, because I'm a sound guy and I'm very annoying to everyone else. But somebody would walk through innocently through the lab, and I'd grab them by the collar, and I'd say, come here, come here, come here. Then I would play it for them, and then they would look at me and go, what are bogus points? So after 2 days of this, I'd had it. And I had a guy who was a hardware tech who supported my efforts and kept things working. Good friend, Chris Brewer, eventually became a very good programmer and did Mach 3, the Laserdisc game. But that time he was new, and we were sitting there, and he was amused by my efforts. And I think it was his suggestion, all this effort, why don't you just put random numbers into it? Gee, that's an interesting idea. So I wrote some routines, and I started jamming random numbers into the Votrax chip. And all 8 bits worked, because basically they had 4 different volumes of the from the higher bits of the 64 phonemes that were available. And immediately it started talking in this great voice. And I thought, wow, this is cool. Now this isn't for Reactor, but this is cool. I'll keep track of this. And it couldn't have been more than a week or two that I walked down, cruising around the lab, seeing what was happening. And Warren was working with some art that Jeff Lee had given him, this sort of Escher-like thing that he had turned into a pyramid. And then he had this character with this nose, and it was kind of hopping around. And that's all it was doing. Warren was just experimenting. He was a brand new game programmer, had never done a game. He had worked on the aforementioned Argus Reactor Video Man Protector, and he was kind of toying around with this, and I looked at it and I just said, Warren, have I got something for you? And then we had the capability of changing the pitch in this voice. So we could I thought we had different characters. We had really low ones and really high ones, and then a Q Bert's everyman, so he was in the middle. And it was functional, too. If you could hear your game when you were playing it, the bad guys would announce themselves by talking before they hit the pyramid, which could be useful to you. Right. We didn't have stereo, but you still, raise your awareness. I'm trying to change the tops of cubes, but I better be wary that Coily or one of those guys is going to come in from the side and perturb my efforts. So that was that. Now, I have to amend this story. I've told this story a number of times, but 2 years ago, I I was cruising the web, and I found some guy who's wired up a Votrax chip and attached a text to Votrax phoneme thing to it, and so you can type in phrases. So I typed in 5,000 bonus points, and his software made the Votrax say it. So I am humbled. I've been maligning the Votrax chip for years, and it's really not fair because the chip can do it.
Right.
I just couldn't figure out what it was. I'm real curious. I meant to look at the string of Votrax phonemes that he generated, but it's been 30 years, so I don't think I remember them anymore.
But this guy also has 30 years of experimenting and documentation to work on, and you had a sheet. Probably a ditto sheet from the company that.
Thank you for cutting me some slack. I mean, I'm not losing sleep over it, but I do think it's only fair to mention that the chip can say it in an understandable manner. I mean, it still sounds dreadful, but so I think I've come up with the absolutely best use for the Votrax chip.
Nice.
And I think we probably sold more Votrax chips than anybody. There was a box that was made for the color computer, and I think it showed up on a couple other things as an accessory, but we sold well more than 30,000 of them. So, yeah, I think ultimately doing the Q Bert voice was the finest destiny of that technology.
Nice.
And the thumper.
The thumper.
Well, there was a guy, a technician, who came up with this. He was he helped move the games, get them set up on test locations, and help build prototypes and stuff. And that was his idea. He said, you have this virtual fall inspired by all, the Coyote from Warner Brothers things. And it had this great, whoa, again, because we have pitch control on the Votrax chip, we could pick a phone in him and have him do that great fall. How neat if there was a tactile, literally cabinet banging thing timed when he hit the bottom. And I wish I could give him credit right now. Rick Tye. Tighe, something like that. Rick Tye was the guy who came up with that notion.
Nice.
So it was a wide open, no cubicle kind of space at Gottlieb.
Nice.
There was one of the smartest guys I ever knew running the place, a guy named Ron Waxman. He was a big guy, and he almost never left his office. And after hours, because I would work a normal 8 hours, and then I'd work another 4 hours. And so after dinner, I'd go and wander into his office. And he told me one thing that has stuck with me. He says, David, nobody knows how to design games. It's just too new. Nobody really knows what's fun. So the activity's sort of a random walk. So the key is to have as many people walking as randomly as possible. And that's what they did. Jim Weiss built a dev system that was based on a PC. And the Gottlieb game system was an extension of its I/O space. So literally you could plug in the Gottlieb coin-op game system into a PC and then use all economy of scale hard drives and compilers and debuggers and everything else. So we had a lot of teams wandering as randomly as possible, which was great for them and hard for me because I was the only sound guy. So I had to sort of triage and say, okay, well, this is a good one. I'll work on this one. Management would have had me working on all of them.
Nice. And before we leave Gottlieb, Mach 3, it seems like Gottlieb hopped on the Laserdisc train, which, crashed after 10 minutes down the track.
Yeah.
Any stories there about doing sound for that game?
Approaching the first target, Captain. Target in sight. Let's get him.
Yeah, well, I have one tremendously sad one from my point of view. So I inherited that first generation soundboard, and then they gave me the opportunity to define the next one. I'm the user of it, and I'm knowledgeable about parts and stuff, though I'm not a double E. So they gave me a double E to work with me, and I searched around and found parts and defined what the next generation soundboard would be. And so basically it incorporated the first generation, because I had all this code and had all these sounds, and I really liked the flexibility. So there was a 6502 and a DAC, but there was a second 6502, and it was going to control a sound chip or chips. And I was familiar with Commodore at that time, and I had a Commodore 64, and I knew about SID. So I contacted Commodore, and I said, can we get some, these parts? Because we would like to buy these chips from you. This would be really great. And they said, sure, and they sold us some chips. And my engineer wired them up. And so I had 2 SID chips with good capacitors on them. So the filters which are implemented by external capacitors, were really better than they ever were on a C64. And I had written the sound system, and I was testing stuff, and I was getting some crazy feedback, and it was amazing, because a SID is really like 3 mini-moogs controlled digitally. They aren't complete mini-moogs, but they're more like a mini-moog than anything, and there's 3 of them. And I had 2 of these chips, so I had a 6-voice mini-moog on there, nice, plus my other stuff. It's fantastic. So why is this such a sad story? Well, because the guy from purchasing waltzed in my office right while I was testing this thing, getting very excited about it, and said, identified me. He said, yeah, I'm the guy. And he said, well, you're using these Commodore chips, aren't you? I said, yes, I am. He said, well, you can't use them. Commodore is the sole supplier of these chips, and they've decided they need them all to make C64s and whatever they're doing, and they really can't supply us in the quantity that we might need. Huh. So, sorry, find something else. Huh. And at that time, there wasn't anything else except for the General Instrument square wave chips.
Was there any? What about the Pokey chip on the Atari? Did you think about that?
Yeah, the Pokey chip is terrific, but they're a competitor. They weren't selling those to anybody.
Right.
Yeah, Pokey. I have a Gottlieb story about Pokey.
Oh, please.
I'll tell you.
We're half an hour into the interview. Let's mention Atari now.
I know. Well, I made some notes on my Atari places where I've touched Atari. But, so I ended up having to use some General Instrument square wave chips, and only distinguish them by having my engineer put some decent filters on them so I could round them off a little bit and make them sound a little less square wavy if I wanted to. That was a tragedy. That would have been so cool. I mean, the next cool thing was several years later when Atari, of course, in Marble Madness started using Yamaha FM chips. Mm-hmm. That was the first. And that's really a huge, huge breakthrough. Yeah. And my career, I spent a whole lot of time on doing a similar thing in pinball. But when you work in video games, they have your competitors' machines, coin-out machines, typically in a room somewhere. So you have access to them, so you can be inspired and understand. So I didn't drink coffee at that time, but you hit that 2:30, 3 o'clock doldrum, and you need something. So I would go into the game room and play my favorite games for half an hour or so. That would get adrenaline going, and I could go back and work. And my favorite games were Missile Command, Centipedes, and Robotron, in no particular order. And yeah, as I was casting about trying to find interesting things to do, I found the patent that Atari had filed for Pokey. And I knew Pokey was on Centipede. So I don't know what inspired us to do this, but it's socketed on the board, and we removed it just for fun. And the interesting thing, when you play Centipedes, if you have access to a coin-op machine and feel bold, do this.
I have one in my basement, but whatever you're going to say, I'm not going to be doing this.
Well, it's socketed. You can just pull it, and then you can put it back in.
Okay.
But what happens is Pokey is many things, right? It's a sound chip. It also does controllers. It might have been used in reading the mouse. The trackball. But it's also a hardware source of pseudo-random numbers. So all the clever things that you attribute to the programming of the spider and the droppers and all that stuff really is limited randomness. And you can prove it. You pull the sound chip, now the source of random numbers are no longer there for the processor. Mm-hmm. And so when you play it, I mean, it works, it's just no sound. All the mushrooms line up on the left edge. The spider hangs out on the left edge. Everything, just all that stuff, the distribution of mushrooms, the behavior of the spider, everything is limited randomness. Cleverly limited randomness. What looks like an interesting algorithm that's going to, smack your ass. No. That's just, it's going to jump this far based on a random number and rinse and repeat. Huh. I found that to be absolutely fascinating. Note on game design is just how how far you can go just by grabbing random numbers and limiting them to a behavior.
Wow. There's your random walk through the centipede garden.
There you go.
Nice. So why did you leave Gottlieb and go to Action Graphics?
Well, the writing was on the wall. I could see that the coin-op business, we'd made several really pretty good games and didn't even go to manufacturer with them because the market was just so tough. And I could see that it was saturated. I was also intensely irritated because at that time they insisted on anonymity. None of us who worked on, let's say, Q Bert, could take credit publicly. We were interviewed by one of the game magazines and had to assume pseudonyms. So the game designer was D. Ziner, and Jeff Lee was Artiste,
right,
and I was J. Walkman. Because it was a corporate policy not to even release our names, so anybody knew who worked on these things.
So you'd be sniped away by other companies?
I guess.
Yeah.
I guess they considered this. I don't know. I don't know what motivated them, but they wildly underestimated the effect on morale. It just. So that was part of it. I mean, I wasn't paid. I was a junior engineer. I wasn't getting paid that much.
Yeah.
And getting no credit whatsoever. And it also looked bad out there.
Yeah.
So I got Mach 3 going. I did about 3/4 of the sounds, built the sound system, did all that stuff, and left. I'd had it. I was probably overworked too, being the only sound guy amidst a whole lot of teams. And I don't know, I was only there 2 years, really. Did a lot of work in 2 years. Found this job, which was a little closer to my house, Action Graphics, which came to be because of Bally's Astrocade, of all things. There's another competitor to the Atari 2600, really.
Yeah, so you could have picked worse than your Fairchild. There was the Astrocade. Yeah,
it's the Astrocade. Well, the Astrocade was better, right? I mean, the Astrocade was really an amazing machine, but it had as one of its properties a proclivity to catch fire.
Right.
Because, engineers built them, and then they go off to FCC testing, then they have to wrap them in aluminum foil, basically, and then they catch fire. That was the problem. So, yeah, the Astrocade failed, but it was a pretty nifty. It was a Z80 machine. You could add keyboards and storage to it and promote it into a home computer. It was way, way ahead of its time in a lot of ways. So a bunch of assets were created for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then it failed, but they still had the software assets. So they spun out Action Graphics to exploit the Astrocade assets on platforms that didn't catch fire.
Nice. That's probably a good business move.
Probably
Let's
good.
focus on things that won't catch fire. So
And they needed a sound guy, so I got hired into that right around 83. And one of the principals of the company wrote a crazy program, which actually is very early Angry Birds, if you think about it. It was called Artillery Duel. And you basically only do two things, right? You would determine an angle, and then you determine the amount of thrust,
right,
and then you fire. That determines an arc, and then you hit something.
right.
Gee, that's a lot like Angry Birds.
So yes, yeah.
With a very primitive interface. And so Artillery Duel was pretty successful, and I think that was the only Astrocade asset that we converted. And it was when I got there, my first task was to do 2,600 sounds for Artillery Duel. And, it's like any platform, I had to, figure out what that sound chip could do and write a small driver that could allow me to sequence information into it and make it do it. That's the only 2,600 I worked on to support, and it ended up being published by a company called Xanax as a double-ender cartridge. The other end was Chuck Norris Super Kicks. And Artillery Duel was okay. I have no idea if there was any. We were a company that created the asset, and then it went off to a publisher, and then they never told us what happened to it. I mean, if we saw it in a store, we'd go, "Oh, look, it's in a store," but we never really knew how anything was going. But then we got hooked up with Activision, and they had 2,600 assets that they wanted to exploit on other platforms, and so that's how a lot of software companies start, at least back in the day, doing conversions. And so the first thing we converted was an Intellivision thing called Beamrider.
And you converted that to the ColecoVision, I believe.
And the Atari 400, 800. And the C64. So this was a great education for me because I'm trying to create the same thing on 3 really different sound systems. ColecoVision is that same square wave chip I'm familiar with from General Instruments. Atari 400, 800 basically has Pokey in it. And then the C64 has SID. So this encouraged me to write a sound system. The notion of a chunk of code that I could create tables for, and then at sort of the driver level, port that to 3 different systems. And that was really the first time I created my own synth controller sequencer thing. Out of the other thing that I learned very quickly was that I'm not in Kansas anymore. In CoinOp, I had a soundboard. I owned a processor. It's my sandbox. I can do anything I want.
Right.
But the minute you're doing console work, you're now seen as the programmer as a parasitic element that eats CPU and storage and poops out sound. And you're seen as a parasitic element. I mean, first off, they get the thing working. They have decent frame rate. And then they start running your sound routines, and if that affects them adversely at all, let's say they were on the edge, and they run your tiny little bit of code and it breaks it, well, it's your fault.
Right.
So I had to be extremely economic in both my space usage and my CPU usage, and yet I still, in order to run the sequencer, I got to run at least 30 times, let's say 100 times a second, do a very tiny amount of work, and then go to sleep and come back, and I need to do that regularly if I'm to sequence anything with with any kind of fidelity. So I learned all of this porting Beamrider, which was a pretty neat game. It was kind of Tempest in a way, as close as you're going to get to Tempest on a on a game console without vector graphics.
So since you were doing the three systems simultaneously, did you have any thoughts about the three different chips of the Atari versus the Sid versus whatever the Coleco had?
Well, yeah, I mean, Sid is the best. Sid is tremendous.
I'm sorry, this interview's over, sir.
Oh, I like Pokey. Pokey is crazy eccentric, right? Pokey is, to my mind, the cleverest use, the most economic use of transistors to make interesting sound. But it's certainly not orthogonal. It makes a class of sound all based on the length of a random shift register. That's the key of their patent, right? You don't ever have random numbers on a computer. You just have pseudo-random numbers, and it's all based on one algorithm where you shift some numbers around and do exclusive OR taps on them and then fold them back in. And it's a really cheap algorithm, inexpensive, wonderfully computationally effective. And Pokey, so if your shift register is 24 bits wide, 3 bytes wide, the result out of the end, your 8-bit random number is going to look really random. And if you just take that raw result and stick it at a speaker, it's going to sound like white noise. Very random, very cool. So if you need that, that's a cheap way of making it. And that's how I did it at Gottlieb. But you look at the patent for Pokey, and what the two guys did was, well, what does a 6-bit pseudo-random shift register sound like? Well, because it's so much less pseudo-random, it sounds somewhat periodic. But it doesn't sound like a square wave. It's still somewhat random. And so based on, then I think they have 3 or 4 flavors of width. And the smaller they get, the more like a square wave they get. But the wider they get, the more bits involved, the more interesting they get. And so if you just want to make electronic, really interesting sounds, Pokey is the absolutely cheapest way to do it. And there's tons of stuff you can do with Pokey. And I only did one creative project on Pokey where I was making my own sounds. And I appreciated it. It was a lot of fun. I liked it. It has what you need as a video game sound programmer to do the things you need to do. Interesting things that communicate stuff, whatever you're trying to communicate. Sid is a much more legitimate synthesizer. Real filters, real oscillators, a much more traditional approach to synthesis, much more orthogonal. You can do many more different kinds of things. As long as you need what Pokey makes, Pokey is fantastic.
So you said you did one creative project with the Pokey. What was that?
That was Pitstop.
Pitstop. So that was also at Action Graphics?
That was at Action Graphics. That was for, I forget the publisher. Epix, yes. And Richard Ditton, I met Richard at Action Graphics. He and his wife worked there, and that's important later on. But Richard was the creative, both the programmer and game designer of Pitstop. And it was programmed on the 800. It was ported to the C64 by Jay Fenton. Mm-hmm. And Jay Fenton is an interesting name because he was one of the 3 founders of Macromedia. So Music Works, Video Works, Flash, everything that comes out of Macromedia, Jay Fenton was there at the beginning. But before there was that, he was working as a consultant for us. frantically trying to, in parallel, as quickly as Richard got some stuff done, he was trying to port it to the C64. But the original cars and skids and driving sounds and all that stuff was done on the 800.
By you?
By me.
Nice.
And then that was ported to ColecoVision too,
Cool.
which is always, from my point of view, the sort of the weakest of the three sound things, because the square wave chip is what it is.
So do you have? I mean, so you need to make a car skidding through a turn sound. Do you just mess with it until something sort of happens, and then what was the process?
Yeah, well, if you can't record a car skidding, if you have to synthesize it, then you have to have deeper knowledge about, well, what exactly acoustically is going on when a car skids through a corner. We have rubber against some somewhat abrasive surface that's grabbing and ungrabbing and producing a pitch sound, but it's producing a lot of different pitch sounds, some of them simultaneously, and they're highly not organized. They're disorganized pitch sounds would describe screeching in a high register. So now we're beginning to head toward a definition of, gee, what should I try to do? Obviously, I'm going to modulate pitch in some interesting way. I'm going to do it very quick. I'm going to do it in a very high register. And probably all these little components are going to be very short. And then maybe I can make something that's like a car skid. And then by doing some maybe limited randomness or parameterizing that, I can make a series of different skids, big ones, small ones, chirpy ones, all the different kinds of things you'd want. So that's the thought process. You really have to think, when you're synthesizing something, you need to think about the physical processes that are moving the air in that manner. Some things are part of fluid dynamics, like explosions. I can't begin to, explosion. Then it's more about, well, we know it's big and then it's not. It's big suddenly when it's not. We know it's disorganized as opposed to organized. And if you have a square wave generator, how do you make an explosion? Well, you don't make a very good one. Let's put it that way. But it's got a lot to do with randomness. So many of these things in the non-organized sound space, things that are not musical, sound effects, need random numbers. So having a good random number generator is so critical. And knowing how to use it, how to limit it, where to stick the randomness in your organization, in your pipeline.
So for something like Pitstop, they gave you I'm assuming they gave you a partially finished game that made no sound, and your job was to insert code that made sound and hand it back? Is that basically?
Yeah, well, you always have to define a protocol with the programmer. I mean, he's going to have events, right? And ideally, all he should need to know, or all he should tell me, is event happened. And then maybe there's a parameter on the event, big event, small event, or event started, event stopped, that kind of stuff. But it's a very simple protocol that you define for the project, and then I respond to those events, making the appropriate thing. I typically have something that I can test out the events independent of the game on the system, so I can know what it's going to sound like. And then, one at a time, I hand them off to them, and then they abuse them. It was at Action Graphics that I discovered that almost any sound that I deliver can be turned into either a machine gun or a helicopter if used inappropriately. We did Decathlon. Okay, so let's take an Atari 2600 David Crane game. We got tagged by Activision to port that to, are you ready? PC Junior.
Wow.
Yeah. Yikes. Yikes is right. And we had some guy who was doing this for us. He wasn't an internal programmer. He was a contractor to us who was doing this. And so, what's your fundamental sound in decathlon? Well, they're footfalls. So, you make some left and right, footfalls of varying intensity, and then you send those off to the programmer and expect them, when you get the program back, to sound like footfalls. Well, I get it back, and I try it, and it sounds like a helicopter. And I'm like, what the hell? Well, this programmer in his wisdom had played the sound not on every logical footfall, but on every animation frame. So yeah, all sounds are subject to programmer abuse.
Sure.
I used to, eventually I built things, when you get into the wild west of like pinball games where you have lots of channels running and a lot of things happening, I used to build things into the sound system that once the sound got started, it would raise its own priority, so it could not be triggered again until it was done. So that took the onus off of the programmer to filter those things out and allowed me to control that kind of stuff out of really enlightened self-defense.
Nice. All right, so while we're at action graphics, I'm not a Commodore guy, but the Commodore people seem to love Rock and Bolt.
Yeah.
It seems like a... So can you talk a little bit about that? And
yeah, I'm particularly proud of Rock and Bolt.
Yeah.
Because this was the finest, most elaborate version of the C64 sound system that I ever built. The programmer wanted to have background music and sound effects. And SID is a 3-channel chip, 3 mono channels. And so you think about, what it takes to make something that sounds like music.
Pokey has 4, I just got to say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
Sorry,
cool. That's cool. So I'm like, okay. But the cool property of SID, from a programming standpoint, is it behaves like a RAM chip. You can write to it really, really fast. So that's not always true with sound hardware. Sometimes they write and they close off their registers and you can't write again until they're done and ready to receive some more stuff. But SID behaved like a RAM chip, so this is very cool. This gave me an idea. And so basically what I ended up doing was virtualizing SID. SID behaves in Rock and Bolt as if it were a 6-channel chip. So music is using, let's call it the 3 lower channels. If a sound effect wants to take over the first channel running in channel 4, it just does that. It starts up, and then because something is running in channel 4, no updates are given to that hardware when it comes down to parsing that one. Soon as the sound effect is done, it continues on exactly where it left off. Or now, actually, no, where it should be now. And this sleight of hand works great. You don't even notice the sound effect has stolen an asset from the music in 9 out of 10 cases. So you get all the sound effects you want, yet when the sound effects aren't happening, the music is running at all 3 channels. So that made me very happy. And it works pretty well. I do the same trick on the square wave version, and it still sort of works. But it works much more gracefully. And I'm glad to hear that people like Rock and Bolt. It was Carl Norgren's first game. It was his baby. He was passionate about it. And at the time, it really didn't get much love. But I'm glad to hear people are actually playing it and like it. It was the most elaborate sound thing that I did at Action Graphics because of that sort of virtualization trick that got me, phantom oscillators.
Awesome. Let's see what else there. You did some stuff for the Atom. Wow.
Yes. They contracted us. ColecoVision contracted us because nobody wanted to touch that tape drive for games.
Sure.
Basically. So they paid developers to do it. And we did 3 big ones. And these all are precursors for what would become CD-ROM games. Right? But at the time, you couldn't quite do that. And so we did a children's title, Richard Scarry's Best Electronic Workbook Ever, which was a huge project from my point of view, because every page had 3 or 4 sound effects and a tune, and I don't know how many worlds there were, how many pages there were. There were a lot. Actually, I think a load would get you a world that was 3 screen widths wide that you could scroll across. Then when you got to the end of that one, you did another load, right? Just like a modern point of view game, except the load was off a tape deck and torturously slow. But, it was a huge project and was fun. We did, I think, probably one of the first, maybe the first computer Jeopardy game was done on the Coleco Atom, and a Family Feud. And they all had, the tunes and the little dings and boops. It was fun.
Nice.
But the bridge product to everything else was Winter Games.
All right. What do you mean bridge? Tell me. Tell me the story.
Well, okay. So Richard Ditton, who really got to do the first successful original product that wasn't a port. Got to do what was tasked with doing Winter Games. Epix already had some kind of Olympic game, and they wanted Winter Games.
Right. I think Summer Games was the first one.
They did Summer Games, so then they wanted Winter Games, and Richard did that. About halfway through that project, the company basically went under. They stopped paying us. And maybe we were 3/4. In any case, we decided that the only way to see our back salaries that we weren't getting was to finish this thing, which we did. And eventually we did finally get paid, which was good. And Winter Games got out there and was one of the more successful Epix titles. Now, while we were waiting to get our back salary, Richard and his then wife Elaine and they invited me, asked me if I wanted to join an effort to create a software company. Not unlike Action Graphics, just run better so that we don't go out of business. Mm-hmm. And so we did that, and like all startup companies, you do that by converting things. And so we had a natural. So we converted Winter Games like crazy. I don't know how many eventually. We didn't do every conversion, but we did at least 5 or 6.
So this was Incredible Technologies?
Mm-hmm. Actually, it was Free Radical Software initially.
Okay. All right.
Elaine came up with that. She was a chemist, her background, and Free Radical Software,
Sure.
But when it came time to taking 10,000 square feet, moving out of our houses, the rental company wouldn't put that name on the sign.
Why?
Too radical.
Too weird. Yeah, sure.
So we had to get creative, and so we came up with Incredible Technologies.
Okay.
But working out of our bedrooms, we were converting things. So Richard converted to the Amiga, converted Winter Games to the Amiga. I converted Winter Games to the Atari ST. So that's my other Atari connection. Now, when I was at Gottlieb, the 4th game that I did for them was based on a license for a terrible movie called Krull. And Matt Householder was the co-programmer of that. And I still know Matt. He's a great guy, and he's still in the industry. And by that time, he was a program manager at Epix. And he was program managing the Atari ST conversion of Winter Games. So he had been at the team who helped build the ROM routines for the Atari ST before he went to Epix. So it's this small incestuous world of people that you know. So he introduced me to his friend Jim Eisenstein, who had written the graphics routine for the Atari ST, the sprite routines and such, which really helped me, the sound guy, port the whole Atari Winter Games to the Atari ST. I haven't done too much of the whole thing, but I'm proud of that one. That was a good one. Then let's see. Then my Atari connections here, drop off dramatically, because we became really in our home space. We were doing C64, Amiga, PC stuff, occasionally Apple II, and we converted the Winter Games to the Apple II and the PC and the Macintosh. Oh my God! But then
is that oh my God because of the tiny one color screen, or
all of that?
Was the sound chip terrible compared to the others?
Well, there is no sound chip in a Mac. You're back to a 8-bit converter, I think, I think it was 8-bit. Actually, in between my joining Free Radical Software, the end of Action Graphics and Free Radical, I was an independent consultant who worked with Jay Fenton and his Macro Media Group. They had a product called VideoWorks where they could do animations and such, but they needed sound. And even on a Fat Mac, there wasn't enough memory to sample anything out. So I was hired to take my Gottlieb work, which was really thin, and I converted it from 6502 to 68,000, and I ran it in the vertical blank. And so it had sounds. It had a whole bunch of cool video game I made a library of sounds that VideoWorks could play on the Macintosh. I had a Lisa at my house. That was so weird. Well, it was the first computer I ever had that you could only turn on.
What do you mean you could only turn it on? I don't.
There was a button on the side. You could turn
for on, but there's no off switch, right?
You can't turn it off. You had to dig down like 4 layers deep into the system menus to find where you could turn the damn thing off. I'm used to a personal computer with an on-off switch, and I wasn't worried about disk routines who are caching things, and I might corrupt the drive or anything. It's a personal computer. I should be able to turn it off.
Sure. Yeah. So your career continued, and I believe you're still doing interactive audio today, right?
Yep.
Tell me about what you're doing now, just in general. And you said an email that if everything goes well, 5 machines from 3 different manufacturers will be sold this year with your audio. So your hand's still in that pie.
Oh, it's a monster year. I didn't really plan it that way, and the only way that happens is that some of the projects I've been working on for 2 and 3 years have taken 2 and 3 years. Normally, a pinball audio package, a normal pinball audio package with everybody working and getting things done, is about a 6-month project for a single person. I mean, that's the scale of it. But things have conspired to change that. I mean, when that was true, the memory that you were writing to was limited. A lot of the pinball audio packages I did were limited by 32 meg. That's the overall size of where everything has to go. The dots and the programming and sound, everything had to fit inside 32 meg. Now it's some kind of secure chip thing or a USB stick, or there's some SSD, or on some of my machines I work at, there's a 60 gigabyte SSD. Well, we might as well just say that's infinite space because, that's crazy. But why not? These things are quite expensive. They're $8,000. You'd be crazy not to use a 60 gigabyte SSD and not have to worry about it.
Sure.
Not spend a second thinking about compression or anything else. Just brute force it, stick it on the drive. So now you're feeding that beast. So projects take longer because, you can have anything. And anything you think of that you might want, okay, let's generate it, let's make it. So the asset packages have become dramatically bigger in the last couple of years because machines are now based on some kind of solid state readable, writable storage. But in any case, this year, five machines. Now, one of them was something I did 8 years ago. I did a pinball based on Spider-Man. And they reissued it this year with new art because they'd lost the license. They used to have a license with anything, Columbia Pictures or Sony. They don't have that license anymore. Now they have a license with Marvel. So they retained the play field. They redid all the art. Mm-hmm. They had to redo a lot of stuff, and they had to redo a lot of the sound effects, which were all based on the movies. Mm-hmm. Anything that was from the movies had to go. But in that time, 8 years ago, I wrote all the music that was in it. So they kept my music, which is about a third of the effort of a pinball sound package. So that machine's being manufactured and sold this year, Spider-Man VE, Vintage Edition. So that's good. And then hopefully going into production this year is the P3 from Multimorphic. I've been working with these guys for 3 years.
I don't know what the P3 is. Is that a game or a platform?
It's a platform. Mm-hmm. It's a pinball platform, and it's a very innovative pinball platform. First off, the bottom 2/3 of the playfield are not wood. It's an LCD screen laid down. So then to have flippers and slingshots, they had to cantilever those out over this because you obviously can't drill through the screen. So they basically had to invent flippers that felt good and slingshots that work that are floating, basically, cantilevered out from the bottom over this. The top third of the play field is a normal pinball play field, except that it's pluggable. So this is a platform. So since the graphics are dynamic, you can pull that top third out, plop a new one in really fast, pick new software. Now you have virtually a new game. Nice. People have tried convertible pins before, but when you're replacing the whole playfield, that's pretty hard.
Right.
This is 2 plugs and a plop, and you're doing it. And then there's other stuff, like there's a XY grid of sensors so that the game knows where the ball is at all times, except when it's on the upper third of the playfield. But then it has switches and stuff. It knows where it is up there. When it's down on the bottom 2/3 of the playfield, the computer can track where the ball is, which is pretty neat. So for virtual targets and stuff, you know when the ball is going to hit a thing.
Or you could have graphics that followed the ball or chased the ball.
Well, they do. They have, right now they do smoke trails.
Neat, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very very inventive thing. It's been 3 years. This guy Jerry Stellenberg is trying to bootstrap his efforts. He built pinball boards to replace existing electronics and stuff, and now he's building a whole machine. It's been 3 years to get to the point where now he has like 3 or 4. He has several production prototypes, and he's going into manufacturing this year, I hope.
Nice.
I've been working on that, so that's 2. Then I started working on the Hobbit, I think July of 2014, and now the Hobbit is coming off the line. Hobbit pinball. That's taken forever. And it's a massive, huge project. It's the biggest pin that I ever have worked on and ever hope to work on. I mean, it's based on all 3 movies.
Mm.
A normal pinball will have somewhere between 10 and 15 modes. When you get out of made play and you lock some balls and you do some stuff, you then have a mode which changes the play field and do this, do that. The Hobbit has 42 of those.
Wow.
Just like it's like almost 3 pinball machines worth of software and correspondingly sounds and music and stuff. It's a massive project. Well, that's being produced right now. People who bought them are getting them, and that's great.
Nice.
Then I took a project with a company in Wales called Andrew Highway Pinball. And a while ago, they got the license for Alien. So they're basing a pinball on the first 2 movies, 79 and 86. Alien and Aliens. And that project's well more than half done. And that's going to be pretty neat. And he's a new pinball company, and he's done some interesting things, like he stuck a 10-inch monitor, LCD monitor, in the playfield. It isn't the playfield, but he's buried it in there like he would an LED insert. You know, like inserts, he's got a monitor which is about 5 inches above the flippers. And I like that idea, because anything that's on the back glass in the back box is only for people watching the player play. You're too busy, your eyes are too busy trying to keep the ball on the playfield.
Yeah.
So if you want to do something interesting for the player, you need to move that stimulus closer to them. And so obviously P3, the entire playfield can be information. And they put the scores and stuff just below the flippers where you drain. I mean, it's always there, and it's real easy to see.
Nice.
The highway system is on the playfield. The Hobbit has a cell phone size monitor that's on the playfield, but kind of up near the top. You know, all this technology is, again, people are reinventing pinball again. About every 5 to 8 years, there's something that allows that basic activity from the 1930s to be, you know, you add flippers to it, that changes it. Right. You add, when you had electronic scoring, you just replaced the score reels. But the minute you put a dot addressable display on there, you can put all kinds of other stuff. And they've really had that for almost 20 years. Now they have high-res LCD, which is fundamentally different than the dot displays. You can put so much more there. But it's also, you could put that, where are you going to put that? Some people, some hobbyists have cloned the display on a Wizard of Oz and stuck it on the panel below the flippers. And it's real eye accessible there. You know? So people are just beginning to figure out, okay, now we have this capability, what do we do with it?
Right. First of all, I love that pinball isn't dead, because it seemed like for a minute it was gone, and now there's this resurgence. And that's wonderful. So, as the sound guy, is there anything that's remained the same over the years about doing sound for pinball for games?
Yeah. The only thing that remains the same is what you're trying to do to the player. And we come at it with so many different technologies. My goal when I was doing Reactor is pretty much the same goal that I have now. I have a number of things I can do with sound that is unique to sound that you can't do with graphics. Sound is much more a manipulator of emotion than typically most graphics are. I can go directly to a reptilian part of your brain and make you scared, make you rewarded. I can make you, shocked, alerted in ways that it's difficult to do with graphics. Because graphics, your eyes are a focusing mechanism. You could be looking there. Something spectacular could happen in the upper left-hand corner. You could miss it, right? But sound is omnipresent. If you can hear sound, your attention is going to be manipulated by it. Sound in the real world tells your eyes where to look. If your eyes aren't looking and you get a big sound, evolution tells us if we're either predators or being predated upon, sound helps us toward that goal. So sound is an incredibly important part of the experience. Good movie directors say it's 50%. And so interactive sound is the same goal as somebody making a movie or a TV show or a radio drama, except that it's just so much harder to do interactively live. You're trying to composite a decent sound mix in a completely non-deterministic space. And sound lives in time. And time is totally fractured by interaction. Interactive events happen interactively. And within constraints, we created a game that limits the possibilities. We've constrained it to say, okay, we're decathlon, we're running. That's about as simple interaction as you can think of. Move the joystick left and right. What do you need? Footsteps. But a pinball machine where the ball is wild, literally, and you don't know what's going to happen, you're trying to provide a real-time interactive soundtrack for that event, the same as I would have done for Reactor, that's informative, that tells the player what has happened, how big and then within what has happened, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Is that a big thing? Is that just, you hit that and we'll acknowledge you hit something on the left side, but it's not really a big deal. Hit this thing over here, which is the glowing, flashing thing. We're going to give you 5,000 points for that, and you want to know that you did that. And things in both video games and pinball machines move so fast visually that if you had no sound, it's many times visually ambiguous as to whether thing happened, unless you leave some kind of 5,000 points shimmering and tracing over and stuff. And you weren't looking there anyhow, so maybe you still missed it. Sounds present important information to the player in an unambiguous manner, in ways that if you can hear the game, you just can't miss it. I mean, if they're not speech, if they're non-speech audio, then you might have to learn the vocabulary of the sounds, but with some 2 or 3 games worth of familiarity, you know what's happening. And in games, pinball or video games, which are eyes busy, hands busy tasks, you have a situational awareness much enhanced by the sound that you could never have just with visuals alone. So my task, right, is to build that information flow in a way that's reliable and works, and then, of course, entertaining and delightful, and, it has to match the current audience's expectations for, what they like to hear. That's the goal. That's why, for Reactor, I tried to make rock and roll. I had to figure out a way to make rock and roll out of hardware that had nothing to do with rock and roll. And now I make a Hobbit game. Well, there's 1,000 constraints on what the expectations are for how the Hobbit pinball should sound, right? You're constrained by what dwarfs do. What elves do. They do magic. Dwarves do things with hammers and swords. Mm-hmm. Men do things, what do men do? Well, they're more organized into armies and stuff like that. So that's the kind of thinking that you want to do, but it's all still part of creating a dynamic stream of audio that is useful, engaging, and entertaining to the player. And that goal is exactly the same. But the way we do it, is it couldn't be more different. When I talk about this, I try to explain it. I say, well, let's imagine in your job that you use a hammer, or you work on cars. Let's say you work on cars, right? And you've been working on cars. What would it do to what you do to have your car improve 10,000 times? And that's what's happened in my world. My car, from 1981 to now, is more than 10,000 times more capable. I don't know if it's better, but it's certainly incredibly more capability. And I continue in my career to surf those changes. And a car mechanic from 1981 would see a somewhat different car, now, with some things that make it harder to work on and electronic stuff. But it's basically still an internal combustion engine running on roughly the same parameters. If a car had improved to the degree that my stuff had, let's see, you'd probably only have to put gasoline in it once a year. It would probably only cost $1,800, and so yeah, that's the thing that's radical in my business, is that I have to constantly surf the change. Mm-hmm. And I'm still, even 10 years ago, I restarted my pinball career, and I was programming to 32 megs. Now I'm programming to 60 gigabytes.
Yeah.
It's, please. A lot of change.
What haven't I asked you that I should have?
Gee, I don't know. You probably got more than you wanted.
No.
I don't know. I'll put a plug in, even though obviously this thing is will persist on and on. But for anybody hearing it, within the next 2 weeks, I'm going to give a 1-hour talk at the Pacific Northwest Pinball and Arcade Show, and I'm going to be talking about one aspect of this is working for startups. Because it dawned on me when I thought about making an hour talk, what would the theme be? And it's just been, I've worked with a lot of startups. Gottlieb was a startup. IT was a startup. Action Graphics was a startup. The first pinball machines I did were for a brand new company called Data East, which has turned into Stern. But I did 5 machines for them, and they were a startup. Obviously, Multimorphics is still trying to start up. And Jersey Jack, the Hobbit company, well, that's only their second machine. And so they're really just changing now from a startup trying to become a big pinball manufacturer. And Highway Pinball, this company that I'm doing Alien for, is definitely a startup. They've only made that many of their first game. And Alien is their second game and their first license, which is always challenging. So, yeah, I'm going to kind of review my work in the framework of, what it's like to work with startups. Some of which are still some of which are gone, some of which are still in business. And I work, yeah, that's it. I was going to say something profound about Atari, but I can't.
Okay. Well, this won't be published before your talk, but I will, if there's an online video or something, I will link to it in the show notes.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So, last question. I think if you could send a message to the people who played Beamrider and Pitstop and stuff back in the day, who are listening to this now, what would you tell them?
Oh. Well, I'm thrilled that they still remember it, and maybe that they're still doing it. Emulation has allowed a new audience to show up and experience these things. When I've done research, I've given several talks about my vintage game experience, and YouTube is an amazing resource. Any game that I can think of that I ever worked on, there's at least one video of it out there, and maybe more, and a lot of them came to being because of the MAME emulator, which does a pretty decent job at being faithful, recreating things. And I'm absolutely thrilled, particularly for some things like Rock and Bolt, which in the day were disappointments for us. We worked really hard on that, and we put our baby out into the world, and then it's in a publisher's hands, and for whatever reason, maybe it was a little difficult to market because it was odd. Maybe they were having a bad quarter and they just, they ignored it. Whatever happened, we never knew, but we knew that it didn't really get out there. But now I see there's an interest, and it's because of MAME and it's because of YouTube that people are seeing these things and go, wow, I never played that. I'd like to play that. Can I get the ROM images and play that now? So I'm absolutely thrilled that people are seeing some of this work, which we were adults. We were working really hard to entertain people, and we're thrilled now, 20 years later, that it's finding an audience. There were 3 games that Tim Skelly, who did Reactor, made at Gottlieb. Only one of them was made. The other 2 just didn't test well enough, and the market was going down. But again, because those ROMs are out there, because MAME is out there, people are playing them now. They're finding an audience, and nothing could make me happier.
Nice. I have what I need. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you for asking.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.